The woman had always felt like she was on top of the world. Every day, she walked into the office with the air of someone who knew exactly where they were going and how to get there. She was always in a rush, always busy with something. People who worked under her knew this. They knew she was someone who didn't have time for pleasantries or distractions. Her role at the company had earned her respect, or fear, depending on who you asked. She wore expensive clothes and carried herself with a certain level of authority. She was proud of what she had achieved, and she made sure everyone else knew it. In meetings, she would speak loudly, clearly, her voice carrying the weight of her position. The people around her would listen, but they also kept their distance. There was something about her that made people hesitate before approaching. Perhaps it was the way she never smiled unless there was something to gain. But there was one person she rarely noticed: the janitor. He was a man she had seen every day but never really thought much about. He worked in the background, cleaning up after everyone. She didn't see his face when she walked past him. To her, he was just part of the scenery, someone who did a job no one else wanted. She often gave him a passing glance, a quick look of judgment. He was just a janitor, someone she felt was beneath her. It wasn't even something she consciously thought about. It was just how things worked in her world. She didn't waste time thinking about people who didn't matter to her, and to her, the janitor was one of those people. The janitor was a quiet man. He moved through the office with a calm, steady pace, always focused on his task. People barely noticed him as he pushed his cleaning cart down the hall, wiped down desks, or emptied trash bins. He wasn't part of the conversation in the break room or the email threads that filled the inboxes of the company's higher-ups. He was simply there, doing his job with dedication, but never seeking attention. His name wasn't known to most of the employees. He didn't wear a name tag, nor did he try to strike up conversations. He just worked. His clothes were plain, and his hands were often rough from the wear and tear of cleaning day in and day out. But there was something about him. His movements were deliberate, and his quiet presence seemed almost to speak volumes. He didn't need to say much. His work spoke for him. The woman had crossed paths with him countless times. Every day she would hurry down the hallway, eyes fixed ahead, never stopping to give him more than a passing glance. She had never bothered to look closely at him, not caring to know who he was or what his life was like. To her, he was just another part of the office, a piece of the background. But to the janitor, it didn't matter who noticed or didn't notice him. He didn't mind being invisible. He had learned long ago that status didn't define a person's worth. The people around him, the ones who had more money, more influence, he didn't envy them. He was content with his simple life. He worked hard, went home, and lived quietly. He had his own story, but no one cared to hear it. And that was fine with him. One particularly hectic afternoon, the woman was running late. She had a major meeting scheduled, one that could decide the future of the project she'd been pushing for weeks. Her mind raced as she walked briskly through the hallway, barely noticing the other employees she passed by. The pressure was on, and she was feeling the stress. Everything had to go perfectly. As she rounded the corner, she saw him. The janitor was leaning over a trash can, emptying it slowly, his back to her. She could see the back of his uniform, the familiar sight of his worn-out boots. Normally she would have walked right past him without a second thought. But today, something irritated her. The hallway was narrow, and she couldn't avoid him. She stopped in her tracks, impatiently tapping her foot. "Excuse me," she said, barely giving him a glance. Her voice was sharp, almost biting. "Can you move out of the way? I'm in a hurry." The janitor didn't respond right away. He simply stood there, continuing with his task as though he hadn't heard her. For a moment she thought maybe he hadn't. "I said, move," she snapped again, a little louder this time. She could feel her stress rising, the tension of the day adding to her frustration. Finally he straightened up and slowly turned to face her. His face calm, almost expressionless. The woman didn't care about his calmness. She was in a rush, and his slow response only made her more annoyed. "You know, it's not like you're doing anything important anyway, it's just cleaning. It's not like you have an actual job to worry about." There was no anger in his expression, just a quiet, steady look. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her words, but didn't say anything. He simply moved to the side to allow her to pass, but his silence only irritated her more. The woman huffed, rolling her eyes as she walked by him. She could feel the burn of superiority in her chest. Why did people like him always have to be in the way? She thought. They just get in the way of the real work. Her steps were quick and heavy as she moved down the hallway, heading straight for the meeting. But the words she had thrown at the janitor lingered in her mind for a moment, like a sharp sting. She brushed them off, though. After all, he was just a janitor. He'd heard worse before. She had more important things to worry about. Later that afternoon, the woman sat nervously at her desk, her fingers drumming against the surface. The meeting had gone well, better than she had expected. She was feeling confident, even a little relieved. The project was approved and it felt like another win in her career. She'd already begun thinking about the next steps, what she would do after this victory. Her phone buzzed. A message from her boss flashed on the screen. "Can you come to my office for a moment? It's important." Confused, she glanced at the clock. She still had a few things to finish up before she could leave. Why would he need me? She thought. But she quickly dismissed any further thoughts and stood up, heading toward the boss's office. As she entered, she noticed that the atmosphere was different. The door was open, but the lights were dimmer than usual. Her boss, Mr. Walters, stood by his desk, but he wasn't alone. There was a man standing beside him, an older man, his clothes simple but neat. His face was calm, not exactly friendly but not hostile either. The woman furrowed her brow. She didn't recognize him. Who is this? She wondered. Maybe a new client or partner. "Ah, there you are," Mr. Walters said, glancing up. Come in. We're just waiting for you." The woman stepped inside, still unsure of the situation. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is Mr. Green," Mr. Walters said, gesturing toward the man beside him. "He's the owner of the company." The words hit her like a punch in the stomach. Her mind raced. She hadn't expected this. She blinked, looking back and forth between Mr. Green and Mr. Walters, trying to process what she had just heard. The owner? She looked at the man again. He didn't look like the kind of person she imagined running a multi-million-dollar company. He was dressed simply, no suit, no flashy accessories. His posture was relaxed, but there was something about him that made her feel small. He didn't have the air of someone trying to impress anyone. Mr. Green smiled slightly and extended a hand toward her. "It's nice to finally meet you," he said, his voice calm. The woman froze. She didn't know what to say. Her mind was still processing the fact that the janitor, the man she'd so easily dismissed earlier, was the owner of the entire company. The same man who had cleaned the hallways she walked through every day, the one she had treated with disdain, was in charge of it all. Mr. Green looked at her, as though he could sense her confusion. "I prefer to stay in the background," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "I like to observe things from a different perspective. People don't expect much from the janitor. It allows me to see the true nature of those around me." The woman felt the floor beneath her shift, like the ground was suddenly unstable. She opened her mouth to speak, but found no words coming out. How could she have not known? How could she have been so blind to the man standing in front of her? Mr. Green gave a small, knowing smile, and then turned to Mr. Walters. "I think I'll leave you two to continue. I just wanted to make my presence known." As he turned to leave the office, the woman stood there, rooted to the spot. Her face burned with embarrassment. The reality of the situation sank in, and she felt a wave of regret wash over her. This was the man she had insulted, the same person she had belittled just a few hours ago. The woman stood frozen in the middle of the office, trying to process what had just happened. Her mind was spinning. She had always been so sure of herself, so convinced that the world worked the way she wanted it to. She had always seen people as categories. Those who were in charge and those who weren't. And in her mind, the janitor had always belonged in the second category. But now, here he was, the owner of the entire company. She barely noticed Mr. Walters speaking to her as he continued discussing business matters. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the scene from earlier in the hallway. The insult, the harsh words she'd thrown at him, the owner. She felt her chest tighten, a knot of discomfort tightening in her stomach. How could I have been so rude, she thought, her palms suddenly sweating. How could I have said that to him? She could still see his calm, unbothered expression as he'd moved aside for her, like nothing had fazed him. In that moment, he had been nothing but gracious, never raising his voice or showing any sign of anger. She had expected him to react, to fight back. But he hadn't. He just stood there, like it didn't matter. But it did matter. To her it mattered more than anything. The more she thought about it, the worse she felt. Her words had been cruel, thoughtless, based entirely on the assumption that she was better than him. But now, in this quiet office, she realized that the roles had been reversed in the most unexpected way. He was the one who had the power, the authority, the control. And yet, he had chosen to live humbly, to blend into the background. What does that say about me? She wondered. What does it say about the way I see people? Her reflection was interrupted by Mr. Walters, who was still talking to her about the details of the company's next steps. But she barely heard him. Her thoughts were consumed by the image of Mr. Green, her former janitor, and how foolish she had been to treat him like he didn't matter. She had a sudden urge to apologize, to go find him and express how sorry she was for what she'd said. But she knew it wasn't that simple. It wasn't just about the words she had spoken. It was about the way she had seen people for so long. She had judged him without a second thought, assuming that his position in the company defined him. But in reality, it was his character, his strength, and his wisdom that had shaped who he was, not his job. As the afternoon wore on, the woman couldn't shake the discomfort she felt. Every time she passed by the janitor's cart, she felt a pang of guilt. She thought about how he must have felt when she spoke to him so harshly. He probably didn't expect an apology, he probably didn't care. But that didn't change how she felt. She knew that she had been wrong. She had learned something in that office that day, something that had shaken her to her core. She wasn't the most important person in the room, no matter how high her position was in the company. And the janitor, the man she had belittled, had more to teach her than she ever could have imagined. The days blurred together, but she couldn't stop thinking about Mr. Green. The janitor, once invisible to her, now stood out. His quiet presence, his grace, his kindness. She realized how unfairly she had dismissed him, and shame settled in. Slowly, her perspective shifted. She started noticing others, the receptionists, the cleaners, offering smiles, kind words, and genuine acknowledgement. It wasn't just about Mr. Green anymore. It was about seeing people differently. Still, guilt lingered. When she finally approached him, apology on her lips, he simply nodded. "It's okay. I've heard worse." It would take time, but she was changing. A week after apologizing to Mr. Green, the woman felt an undeniable change inside herself. The arrogance and superiority that had once defined her interactions had melted away, replaced by a deep sense of respect for others, especially those she had once looked down upon. Her relationships with her coworkers were different now. She no longer felt distant or aloof, but more connected and humble. Still, there was an unsettled feeling within her, a quiet tugging at her conscience, as if there was more she needed to do. Her thoughts often drifted to Mr. Green. The way he had accepted her apology without judgment or anger had left a lasting impact on her. He had displayed a calm, quiet strength that she hadn't recognized before. His patience, his ability to remain unruffled despite her earlier behavior, seemed profound in a way she couldn't easily put into words. He wasn't just a janitor to her anymore. He was a person who embodied wisdom she hadn't noticed before. One afternoon as she sat at her desk, she saw him again, slowly cleaning the hallway. Something inside her stirred. She stood up, walked toward him with purpose, and when she reached him, she spoke. "Mr. Green," she said, her voice steady but filled with sincerity. "I just wanted to say thank you. You've taught me more than I ever realized. You've reminded me of what truly matters in life." He looked at her, a small, knowing smile tugging at his lips. "I'm just doing my job, same as you." His words resonated deeply within her. It wasn't about titles or positions of power. It was about treating people with kindness, humility, and respect, no matter their role. She had spent so much time focused on her own status that she had forgotten the true value of human connection. Though she could never undo the past, she realized she had the power to choose how to move forward. A sense of clarity washed over her. The future was uncertain, but one thing was certain. Her approach to the world, and to the people in it, would be different from now on. She had learned an invaluable lesson, and that lesson would shape her for the better.